My name is Ken Coleman. I used to be the director of the Center for European Studies many years ago. I don't know what I am now, emeritus or something. And I used to be the director of the International Institute, but it's great to be back here. And it's great to host our speaker here, Dimitri Sotiropoulos. Dimitri is a professor of political science at the University of Athens. And he is here in the United States for the year as a visiting scholar at the Center for European Studies at Harvard, and an Onassis Visiting Professor at the Fletcher School of Law in Diplomacy at Tufts. And it's wonderful to have him here visiting Ann Arbor for the day. He has been, in the past, he was a senior research fellow at the Hellenic Observatory at the London School of Economics. And he was a visiting fellow at the Southeast European Studies at St. Anthony's College in Oxford. At Harvard, Dimitri is going to analyze the strategies of governing elites in European contemporary European democracies. And he's going to talk a little bit about the work he's doing on that. He has his PhD from Yale University, which he was awarded with distinction in 1991. He has a recent book out from 2015 on austerity and the third sector in Greece, civil society at the European front line. And he has a book, a new book, sorry, I have these backwards. The 2015 book, that's 2015, and then the 2018 book, Socioeconomic Fragmentation and Exclusion Under the Crisis, which is about Greece. It's a delight to have him here. He and I had a wonderful conversation this morning at breakfast. He's a very interesting person, and I'm delighted to welcome him here to Ann Arbor.
Hello, I appreciate this generous introduction, and I really want to thank the University of Michigan, the director of the Center for European Studies, and also Professors Coleman and Tsebelis for inviting me here and for discussing with me various very interesting issues. I'm going to talk to you about the following question: how different European countries, namely 4 South European countries, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, slid into the economic crisis, and then how they managed in a similar fashion the crisis, not always with similar success, and how they implemented, in particular, on the one hand, policies to streamline their economies, and on the other hand, policies to reform their public sectors with an emphasis on the organization of their governments and the public administration, before I conclude about what takes place today in these 4 countries in comparative perspective. So my research questions are the 3 questions which you see here. I start from the basic information which you already know. Crisis occurred earlier in the United States, but it hit Greece and the rest of South European countries later on, starting from the year 2010. So why and how did each of the 4 countries put itself in such a difficult position, very difficult position? As you already know, Greece was on the brink of economic collapse. What were the public policy responses and institutional changes that occurred in the wake of the economic crisis? And what was the outcome of this crisis regarding economic policies and governance? This is an outline. I have a very, very brief theoretical framework. Then I will talk about the economic policies before I move to changes in government, organization, and public administration, and then I will conclude. So the first part has to do with how we understand the inertia that was very observable in many of these countries, even though Greece, Portugal, Italy, and Spain, before the crisis started, had already been subjected to large-scale pressures. These were Europeanization, which was continent-wide effort to make economies and political systems of member states of the European Union to converge, and also globalization. And yet, in regard with, for instance, labor markets or public administrations, we observed much more inertia rather than change. There are very different theories about this. I just mentioned the historical institutionalist approach or the approach of Professor Tsebelis. I submit to you that change may take obviously very long time to occur until a certain point is reached. This is usually known as a critical juncture that usually takes the form of an unpredictable shift, sometimes stimulated by an external condition. The economic crisis was such a condition, and my main argument is that some of these ideas, which are policy ideas, that we associate with austerity along neoliberal lines, or ideas related to public sector change, which we associate with new public management, had been for a long time around. Yet, even though various governments had attempted to change policies in the economy and in governance on the basis of these ideas never gained ground. It took a major crisis, the economic crisis, which started in 2010, for such large-scale shifts to occur. So that's why I suggest that we could understand the Eurozone crisis as a critical juncture, after which we had the change in economic policies, welfare policies, labor market policies, and also public sector reform. That means that when the time comes that you have external financial constraints and time pressure, then possible other policy options are shadowed. Reform may take probably one only path. This is a path that seems the only possible solution, and that is probably what happened, if not in all, in several of the countries I'm going to discuss, along with other countries which do not include in this analysis. For example, one could make similar arguments about Ireland, Cyprus, and other European countries. There is a line of thought that says that the crisis in the countries I'm talking about would have never taken place if these countries had not joined the Eurozone. It's all the fault of governments who decided to join the Eurozone and have a common monetary policy, and that, according to this current of thought, was sooner or later to drive these countries into a crisis. And this is because there have been, for a long time, institutional and structural asymmetries in the Eurozone countries. In the same economic zone, you have countries which have one currency, but they do not have the same competitiveness. They do not have the same production capabilities. They are not able to export in the same scale and with the same quality of products. And some of these countries, for example, Germany or the Netherlands, are more export-oriented than other countries which are oriented towards a growth which is demand-driven, and it's domestic demand-driven. I think that is a valuable argument, but it does not tell us the whole story, and I believe that given the evidence that we now have, that not all countries were subjected to the same crisis. The crisis was not equally grave in all Eurozone members, and also the fact that crisis-ridden countries were able to exit the crisis at different time points. We should probably make our minds around the idea that, yes, there was an externally disfavorable environment, the Eurozone, but the blame about why the crisis occurred, why it took the shape it has taken, and why it was so difficult, for instance, for Greece to exit the crisis, is something that we should be attributing to past policies, long path-dependent policy trajectories, and also decisions of national governments. Please remember that even before the crisis occurred, many of the Eurozone member countries were unable to reach the targets which the European Union had set for them. These were couched in the Lisbon Strategy 2010. Nobody remembers this. It was a long-term strategy to promote growth and social cohesion. And then we have another strategy which is still alive. Probably it's not well. And this is the Eurozone 2020 strategy that talks about creating smart, competitive economies out of the economies of the European Union. The countries I'm talking about were not on the right path to accomplishing all these goals before 2010. They had traveled along different pathways. So, for example, Portugal and Spain had based a large part of their growth on real estate and the construction sector, along with some services. Portugal, even before it was hit by the crisis, had grave economic problems. The economy of Portugal had slowed down a long time before the global financial crisis started. Spain, on the other hand, was a country that was thriving on a bubble. This was the bubble of the real estate, and that was based on credit provided by Spanish banks. The Greek economy was a different case. Greece had many more fiscal problems compared to the problems of the public finances of Portugal and Spain. Greek exporters were not as strong as their other South European counterparts. In addition, in Greece, after the country entered the Eurozone, we had a rise in salaries and pensions, which was not called for. It was not corresponding to the growth model of the country. And then, thus, there was an increasing phenomenon of accumulating public debt. Italy had a strong export sector. On the other hand, Italy, as you probably know, also had a very inefficient public sector and had also accumulated high public debt, not as high, of course, as the Greek one. Here is a very quick view of what was the situation before 2010. Basically, we don't talk about very poor countries. These are countries which, as you see on the left-hand column, before 2010, were countries that, based on this obviously incomplete indicator, which is the GDP per capita, were doing well. There were countries which were already unequal before the crisis struck. Look at the Gini coefficients. And there were also countries which already have poverty that is related to various long-term unemployment problems. The classic example is Spanish unemployment, which had been very high for a long time. And that is shown, I think, in the prior to last column. And then, again, I want to stress this point because there has been a lot of, I think, misplaced international attention about how undeveloped South European countries have been. Particularly, this is the case for Greece, less so Portugal. We talk about countries where the human development index is and was quite high. The public finances were indeed problematic in Greece already before the year 2010, when the Greek crisis started. In the year 2008, the Greek public debt was already above 100%, as was the Italian one. The government deficit was unbelievably high in the case of Greece. It was not so much, however, in the case of Portugal. And I'm making this point because I will come back to this point later on in a few minutes when I will talk about the medicine given to these countries so that they recover from the symptoms of their economic illnesses. Regarding government revenue and government expenditure, what you see basically is that these countries I'm talking about, particularly Greece, less so Spain, were unable to raise government revenue. And that is related, of course, to the fact that in the case of Greece in particular, you have a situation in which there is a long tradition of tax evasion. On the other hand, there is also a long tradition in these countries, as there is in other countries like France, of keeping government expenditure at rather high levels, which you see, for instance, even after the crisis started on the right-hand column. So, to make a long story short, a major argument which I would like to put forward is that no, it was not exclusively the fault of Germany or the construction of the Eurozone that the economic crisis hit these 4 countries. There were problems, and these were problems which you could put in a different time scale. First, we had the global financial crisis related to the economic problems in this country, the USA. Then you have the asymmetries, which were already evident at the starting date of the Eurozone. Then you have long domestic problems of the countries under study. And the catalyst effect for the other countries, Spain, Portugal, and Greece, was, of course, the near collapse of the Greek economy, about which I'm going to mention very basic facts. So in the winter of 2009-2010, both Greek decision makers and, unfortunately for Greece, foreign organizations such as credit rating agencies, the European Commission, and international organizations found out that the country was unable to service its public debts. Greece could not go on the international markets. The interest rates were forbidding. In fact, the Greek government, at various points, not only in that period, but also later on, and over the last 6-7 years, has reached the point of almost being unable to pay out next month's salaries, by which I mean public employees' salaries and pensions. The country was at the brink of default, and then Greece asked for international support. This was an application to the European Commission, EC, European Central Bank, ECB, and the IMF, and they intervened probably belatedly because they offered the first package which contained large funds of financial support plus conditions in mid-2010. That was a critical juncture, and that was a series of financial support funds which were channeled into Greece because the country was unable not only to service its public debt, but also to absorb these funds in a way that would help it overcome the crisis sooner than later. Greece is a country which, as you have seen, has not been very efficient regarding its public sector. The public sector, as I will show in a minute, was probably more grown than it should have been in terms of its size, and it is also not very efficient in terms of raising taxes or distributing welfare benefits. Overall, after the crisis started, Greece received this amazing, astounding amount of financial support. Overall, in 3 packages, 324 billion euros. Not in 1 year, but between 2010 and last year. What happened in the same time in the other countries? The Portuguese economy was not suffering from the fiscal problems I hinted upon when I talked about Greece. Yet Portugal, who had was just able to overcome its own economic problems when the crisis struck, Portugal was more or less pressed to ask also for financial support. This was again a petition made by the Portuguese government. That happened 1 year after the Greek financial support package was put together. That is, in May 2011, Portugal received an IMF EU bailout package of 78 billion euros, and that also came with harsh conditions. That was what we call officially, the official term is Economic Adjustment Program for Greece, for Portugal, for Cyprus, for Ireland. This is the official terminology. Italy never reached the point of signing such a memorandum of understanding, namely an official document in which the financial package was specified and the particular detailed policy measures were spelled out by the international lenders to national governments, which received the rescue packages. Italy never reached this stage, but the Italian government received a strange letter, which was co-signed by the governor of the ECB, Trichet, and himself also the governor of the Bank of Italy, in which letter the Prime Minister of Italy in August 2011 was explicitly informed that if he did not pursue policies which looked like the austerity policies dictated in the MOUs signed with the other countries, Portugal, Greece, then the Italian economy would not survive. It was a kind of informal memorandum of understanding. Spain did not have the same problems as Greece. However, the Spanish banks probably could not have survived if the European Commission had not stepped in. The European Commission addressed particularly the problem of Spanish banks and channeled 100 billion euros for the recapitalization of Spanish banks. Second part of this talk has to do about this common package which in formal or informal ways was channeled to all these countries. It was a series of measures. These were some only of the measures which the four countries under study, and particularly those which had signed memoranda of understanding, such as Portugal and Greece, were obliged under external pressure to implement. So sharp cuts in public investments, freeze and then slashing of public sector pay, increase in taxes and also social insurance contributions, because a very large part of the story I'm telling has to do with the pension systems, which had been on the brink of collapse. They still are, but you're not supposed to say this to anyone. And also we had cuts in pensions and welfare benefits. In addition to these economic and fiscal policies, we have other kinds of changes. These were changes that affected the production and labor markets of these countries. For a long time, advocates of changes in labor policies in the US and in Europe had advocated that the European system of collective bargaining, corporatist arrangements, and very high employment protection were depressing the potential of the European economies to become more competitive compared to Japan or the US. In the countries I'm talking about, these labor policy measures had been sometimes legislated, but they were never really implemented to the extent that one would have thought. It was only after 2010 that we have seen the suspension of collective bargaining. Labor unions were sometimes not even invited to discuss the levels of salaries or changes in labor legislation regarding working time or the compensation offered to workers who were laid off. Finally, on last line, in the countries I discuss now, we had another phenomenon not related to the labor market, but to the production market. There are many occupations and professions which are closed. So if you are a notary or a pharmacist, you are going to remain a notary or a pharmacist for life, and then very few people could be able to access your profession. These still, to some extent today, are occupations which are closed. There are competitive entrance examinations to enter these professions, or, that is the case of notaries, or there are very strict regulations which dampen, as a matter of fact, the possibility to open, let's say, a new pharmacy. And that has to do with many other professions and occupations, and the pressure was to open up these professions and occupations. So what was the result of all these measures and the crisis? Please remember, we need to factor in two things: the gravity of the crisis and the austerity policies. The results have been tremendously negative for Greece. In the span of 6 years, Greece lost 26% of its GDP. That was less so in the other countries, which had not been in the same negative growth path and had not suffered from the same problems as the Greek economy had before the crisis started. Public investment was cut. Public spending cuts affected mostly Greece and Spain, and the unemployment soared in Greece, reaching unbelievable high levels. That was the worst case. I have put on this slide the worst year for all these countries. After 2013, unemployment started declining gradually, but the poverty rate also became very, very high. So the crisis endured, but not all 4 countries recovered in the same way and at the same time. The Greek economy started recovering only slightly in 2014, but then it relapsed. This had to do with the government turnover of January 2015. A new coalition came to power. The new coalition believed in vain that it had negotiating power to change completely the austerity packages which had been implemented in the Greek economy. Negotiation with the European authorities did not go well. It was probably misconceived as a strategy to start with. And then it took a very long time for the Greek economy to recover, given that the coalition government, which was composed of the radical left party and the ultra-nationalist party in Greece, only achieved much better performance for the Greek economy since 2017. So we have to take into account political party systems and polarization and these abrupt changes in government. By contrast, I'm contrasting the case of Greece to the other 3 countries, probably more to Portugal and Spain than Italy. In Portugal, in the beginning, there was some kind of consensus. Even Portuguese labor unions accepted that there should be some kind of change of policy and that fiscal consolidation was necessary. Portugal recovered in 2014 with a small percentage of growth over the previous year. Spain, which also was a country that had a more consensual party system, and you did have in Spain also some kind of convergence of political parties over the need for economic policy change. We see that there was an earlier recovery in Spain than in the case of Greece. In Italy, we have a different phenomenon. The center-right government of Berlusconi for a long time did not apply any kind of consolidation of the economy. After Berlusconi fell from power, there was some convergence among political parties, but then government instability took place. Thus, it was only in 2015 that the Italian economy experienced a minimal growth, and it is still not doing very well today. The political impact of the crisis and the management of the crisis. I want to keep these explanatory factors together. It's not only the scale and the gravity of the crisis, but it's the way the crisis was managed with a common recipe, regardless of the particular social, economic, and political environment of the 4 countries under study. So you had a similar political impact, and I will also show some differences, but let me first underline the similarities. So you had protests, labor protests against the Troika in Portugal, not immediately, but after 2 years of applying austerity policy. In Spain and Greece, you have the very well-known protest movements of the indignados, people protesting in the squares of Athens or Madrid and converging towards meeting points. Regardless of their political orientation, there were right-wing voters, left-wing voters, some people who had never been active in politics, believed in this narrative, which we can discuss later on in the Q&A session, which says that the fault is not with the national governments. The economies may not be, the national economies may not be as productive as they should have been, but generally the crisis, the causes of the crisis and the management of the crisis, all this went wrong, and that was the fault mostly of international actors, IMF, European Commission, and so forth. And then in Italy, you have labor strikes. You did have labor strikes, but probably the most important impact is the rise of new parties. The party Podemos, which means the We Can, radical left party, very similar to the party which we call Syriza, the coalition of radical left in Greece. The Ciudadanos, which means citizens, as you know, and it is a center-right party in Spain, and probably, although I have not done research on this, One could relate somehow the rise of Catalan nationalism with the economic crisis, but I should have put a question mark on this statement. In Greece also you have the rise of the ultranationalist party, the ANEL party, which, as I mentioned, excuse me, formed the government with the radical left and remained in power between 2015 and the month of January 2019. In the meantime, you had short-term, brief technocratic governments. There is a discussion in some conferences that we have the rise of technocratic governments exactly because you have austerity policies which are dictated by international organizations. I think this is not a convincing argument. These were very short-lived technocratic governments in Italy and Greece. You had long-term political governments, by which I mean elected governments. In Spain, the center-right party, Partido Popular, was in government between 2011 and last year. That was not a technocratic government. And in Greece, the technocratic government lasted for a very short period, just 9 months. What is important, however, is the decline of the center-left in Italy and Greece, which followed suit the decline of the social democratic and center-left parties in other European countries. And in Portugal, you have the decline of a country which calls itself social democratic, but it is the center-right party of Portugal, PSD. So generally, you had radical changes in government and shifts in party systems. What were the differences? So as I just mentioned, PSD party in Portugal, the center-right party, which had been in government for a long time, over the last 3 decades, not in successive terms, but had been in government for a long time, was suddenly and surprisingly replaced by the government which now is in power in Portugal, the socialist government of Antonia Costa, supported by other parties of the left. In Greece, existing parties, not so much new parties, existing parties, the Syriza and the Golden Dawn, which is a Nazi party, became much stronger than they had been in the past. And the largest one, the radical left party, teamed up with the ultranationalist ANEL party. In Italy, there were such parties which became stronger. The Five Star movement and the Lega Nord became much stronger. And after the Democratic Party under the leadership of Renzi did not really perform well while it was in power, you had instability that led to the current populist government which is in power in Italy. And in Spain, as I mentioned, you had the shaking but long-standing government of the Partido Popular, the center-right government. It was replaced only last year by the socialists, who are now have just lost parliamentary support, and we have elections in Spain in April. Last part of this talk, the economic crisis caused government organization and public administration changes. As I mentioned in the past, we did not have large-scale shifts in organization and structure and also the management of public sectors in Southern Europe. There had been long-standing legacies of state interventionism in the economy. Some privatizations had taken place, of course, as in many other European countries, but generally you had historical legacies which were strong. Italy and Spain were very decentralized and remained as such. Portugal and Greece were and still remain probably among the most centralized countries of the European Union. However, what I would like to show now in the next 2 slides is that before the crisis, all this system with public sector which was inefficient, state interventionism in the economy, and different levels of government were already in trouble even before the crisis started. There was erosion of political legitimacy. So I know this is a lot of data, but perhaps you could look at the satisfaction with democracy. Look how small was, with the possible exception of Spain, even before the crisis started. Okay, and then if you use the world governance indicators of the World Bank, which is, of course, a debatable measure given that it ranks countries, you would see that in the scale between minus 2.5 all the way to plus 2.5, Greece and Italy were not doing well regarding rule of law and voice and accountability. However, I would like to put a question mark to what I'm saying, because if one uses the prior to last indicator, which is average turnout, we have quite large average turnout between 1997 and 2009 in elections, because these were democracies in which parties were not just the protagonists of what we call party democracy in Europe. These were democracies in which parties were able to promise jobs, to deliver policies, to basically control many political institutions and administrative institutions. So people often rallied around parties with which identified for a long time and went out to vote. Trust in political institutions. I show how it changed. Sorry, it had changed. When? Between 2003 and 2010. So for the case of Greece, look how, for instance, in the year 2003, trust in parties, based on Eurobarometer data, was at 28%, and it fell just before the crisis started to 5%. This is, I think, the most striking piece of information, how trust in political institutions had declined in Greece before the crisis started. Generally, the only institution which probably survived, if I can use this verb, is the courts. Okay? In other South European countries, you also have similar phenomena before the crisis started, but not as bad in the case of Greece. Public administration reforms, again, we have the same situation, common recipe, common solution offered to all these countries, reorganization of central services. How? By merging administrative units. Then pressures to decrease the size of public employment, an effort to legislate, if not to implement, patronage-proof procedures of employment, and to promote civil servants, given that we talk about very politicized public administrations. The worst case is probably Greece. The best case, which is less politicized, was the case of Spain. Cuts in salaries of public servants. However, many of these reforms fell in the familiar implementation gap. There was a reluctance of politicians of different parties, obviously civil service unions, but also within ministries of the bureaucrats themselves to obey any kind of changes regarding moving to other directorates or receiving, for instance, new kinds of instructions on how to work along the lines of new public management, and so on and so forth. You could call it obstruction. I do not use percentage shares because they don't give the real picture. I'm using here absolute data. So you had, in absolute figures, large-scale decrease in public employment. I think in Spain, which, however, should be understood as a country which has a federal structure, thus there were cuts in public employment at the level of regions, the autonomous community, and in Greece, which has a much more centralized, non-federal structure, you had the largest cuts in public employment. In Italy and Portugal, not so much, and there are reasons for this, which have to do with, for instance, in Portugal, the intervention of courts. Portugal is a country in which the Constitutional Court it declared many measures of the austerity policies as unconstitutional. I here offer some percentage figures regarding not the size of public employment, but cuts in compensation. The worst case is, again, the case of Greece. So share of employment compensation in total government expenditure, rather abrupt cut in the case of Greece, much less so in the other three countries. And there are changes in the human resources. I have two slides on this. So there was, in the beginning, no or minimal replacement of retirees. So the states of the 4 countries would pension off employees and they would not replace them. Then hiring stopped immediately after some time because that was a set of policies imposed on the 4 countries by international organizations and internal lenders. Then there was also a non-renewal of fixed-term contracts. This is very important to understand the public sector in the 4 countries. We don't hire civil servants. We hire people on fixed-term contracts for 6 months. So we can ask them to vote for us, and if they do so, we can rehire them. Okay? And that is typical. It happens in other countries, but I wanted to make sure that we are on the same page on this. But then something more dramatic happened, dismissals of permanent employees, not to a very large scale, but in Portugal or Italy, but to a larger scale in Spain or Greece. So among the 4 countries, the Greek case was the one where we had very grave changes in regard with human resources management. And what is, I think, important to note is that the other countries, the other 3 countries, had not been under the same fiscal crisis as Greece had been, but they also were pressed to follow more or less similar policy measures regarding the size and compensation of public employment. And in addition, we had measures which related to the performance of civil servants. In many European countries, particularly South European countries, it is not part of the administrative culture of employees, civil servants in particular, to be subjected to evaluation of the kind we know, for instance, in universities. There is lack of tradition of this. There is resistance towards such performance reviews, and still this is not progressing, for example, in Greece. There were other changes, however, related to working conditions, for example, the number of working hours. And there was an effort to move civil servants around, because given that there was no more hiring, there was an obvious need to move redundant civil servants from one administrative unit to the next. This didn't go well either. However, there was a better situation regarding citizen administration relations. So there was a digitalization of public services in Southern Europe. Before that, if you had the unfortunate situation of having to talk to Spanish, Greek, Italian, less so Portuguese civil servants, you would need to be waiting in line, trying to explain your case, being sent to another service, being invited back. Now, in all these 4 countries, including in particular Greece and Portugal, we have progress. Particularly businesses now do, not all, but a large share of their transactions with the state authorities over the internet. And that also has happened, probably less so, with regard to the interaction between individual citizens and state authorities. There are, of course, still large problems on this. As there are problems with regard to corruption, I can talk about corruption later on, but I wanted to mention that over the last 10 years, we had also an effort to pass new anti-corruption measures, and that is related to digitalization. Why? The less you allow citizens or businesses to come to contact with political officials or administrators, the fewer the chances that there will be under-the-table transactions. So there were new institutions, new policies, new ways of citizen-administration transactions, partly owed to the digitalization of public services. Also, we had something which I think I should stress. This is the style of policy making changed. All 4 countries, including those who had and still have decentralized authorities, were pressed by international organizations to centralize decision making in order to streamline their economies and have their economies exit the crisis. So on various policy issues, as I said, social consultation almost vanished. Stakeholders rarely played any role for many years after 2010. But in addition to this, you need to figure that we have countries in which sometimes at the regional level or at the level of central government, political officials such as regional governments, governors, or ministers had some room for maneuver before the crisis started. This became circumscribed after 2010. Ministries of finance, which are all powerful in many countries, regardless of whether there's a crisis or not, became all powerful. And many competences of various policy sectors, irrelevant to financial and economic policy, were transferred to the ministries of finance, in addition to the strengthening of the peak of the executive. So the prime minister's offices grew and became very much more cohesive, and that was an effort which was related to the fact that external actors, international lenders, would periodically visit these countries and ask the primary decision makers, prime ministers and their entourage, how was the implementation of austerity policy progressing. Thus, this peak of the executive in each of the four countries felt obliged to concentrate competences, but also real power in its hands. Despite the common policies which I have sketched out for you, we have different results. All countries encountered planning and coordination problems. It's very difficult to suddenly apply economic and public sector policies which had been resisted or neglected for so many years before 2010. Portuguese and Spanish governments proved more capable in managing the crisis. The Italian and the Greek governments not so much. I think the worst case is the case of Greece. On the other hand, we have to differentiate. Indeed, in some cases, the economic crisis arrested some developments, and it accelerated other developments. So in the period before 2010, owing also to external policies, such as the European Union policies of regional development, European Union regional policies, there was an effort to decentralize authority and to decentralize also the managing of regional and local economies. That had not progressed very much in Portugal and Greece, but there was a pressure from abroad to decentralize these countries in terms of who decides at the local and regional level on the absorption of funds and the dispensing of European Union funds. That was arrested as a development. But there was the accelerated development which I mentioned, the strengthening of the peak of the executive and the Ministry of Finance. So, as I come to a close of this talk, how it is the situation today. This is the last available data which I tried to offer, neglecting, pushing aside any data which are just projections. It's very difficult to be sure about numbers in many of these countries in Europe, not only in Southern Europe, exactly because there is a negotiation among statistical services on the one hand and international observers such as the European Commission on the other hand. So Portugal and Spain are growing. Portugal and Spain have already very high public debt. The Greek debt is not doing very well despite all these austerity measures, because obviously the basis of the economy, the production of the economy of Greece has shrunk. The unemployment rate has declined in Greece by 8 percentage points, but it's not doing very well. And poverty and social exclusion still are something to reckon with, because this is really a disappointing performance over there. And it's something that none of these policy measures I talked to you about addressed, that there would be large-scale new and old poverty combined together because of these austerity measures. My conclusions: South European governments embarked on various changes in strategic planning, interministerial coordination, legislation by fiat, and centralized control. I should have mentioned that in this long period of managing the crisis, parliaments were sidestepped. Many measures were taken by presidential decree or through issuing ministerial circulars. Also, despite the fact that the origins of the economic crisis were different in the 4 South European countries, the responses to the crisis were similar. For instance, intensification of the new public management model, which, as you know, is an effort to replicate models of decision-making and managing private companies by transferring such models onto ministries and state-owned enterprises. Also, regarding public sector reform, even though we talk about different public sectors, there was a common set of policies, the attempt to introduce performance criteria, client-oriented shift to improve on citizen administration relations, and varying degrees of cutting salaries and also the numbers of public servants. The 4 South European countries had followed different development paths and governance models before the crisis. The eruption of the crisis proved to be a critical juncture. After the crisis, there was some policy convergence on many different public policies. Some I mentioned, some I did not, but I could talk about welfare as well. And there was a similar policy package regarding the reorganization of the government and the reorganization of the public administration. Policy convergence should be, I think, explained through these factors I have been underlying throughout this talk: strong external pressure and requirements put to the 4 countries under study by the international creditors, and adoption of the prevalent economic austerity models. And these policy shifts, of course, should not be taken to be permanent. We had implementation gaps. These implementation gaps have had to do with the fact that the country started from a different point of crisis. It was more grave in Greece and probably Portugal than in Spain and Italy. There was divergence in implementation, and this has to do with long-term state-society relations, for example, distrust towards political and administrative institutions, which I had indicated by showing percentage data on trust in institutions. The legacies are particularly helpful to explain why, compared to the rest of South European countries, Greece has remained a reform laggard and has yet, to this day, to achieve a notable recovery. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you for this talk. We'd like to open it up to audience Q&A. And if you just want to raise your hand, I will run the microphone to you so you can be heard.
Dimitri, you referred to the difference between Greece and the other countries in terms of lack of convergence in terms of the political system. But on top of that, wouldn't we say that the fact that there is a government that does not adopt at all the logic of these reforms is responsible for the fact that Greece has remained a laggard in the whole process?
Okay, shall I take one question by the time? Yes. So thanks for this question. Greece did what you say, namely, since 2015, has had a government which was adopting for a long time, for at least 8 months in the beginning of 2015, and even later on, different policy solutions. The Greek government, composed of the radical left and the ultra-nationalist party, wanted to go back to state interventionist policies and to increase domestic demand by raising salaries and pensions, which, given the level of the public debt of Greece, could not have happened. But in addition to your correct point, one has to add that, except for this difference, there is another difference of the Greek case. The center-right government which in many other countries would have been expected to follow austerity policies and to adopt policies that would be converging with the rest of the European countries and the European Commission, the center-right government, which was a government that was headed by the center-right party called New Democracy, was one of the largest and most formidable political forces behind rejecting austerity when the crisis started. So even the center-right government, which the center-right party, I'm sorry, which was in opposition when the crisis started, and only arrived in power in late 2011 in Greece, was a party that would not admit that given the grave fiscal situation of the country, some austerity was necessary. It was only after gaining power that is forming a coalition government with a few other parties in November 2011, almost 20 months after the crisis had broken, that this center-right party, which you normally expect to adopt neoliberal policies, that this party finally admitted that it should follow some kind of austerity policy. So this is not something that you would find in the other three countries. The Partido Popular, it was a center-right party which pursued conservative policies. In Portugal, some people say that you have the reverse of the Greek cases. Why? Because not only the center-right party of Portugal, the PSD, but also the Portuguese socialists for some time followed typically conservative North European economic policies. So the Portuguese were totally different compared to Greece regarding the, I think, the profile, the ideological profile of the economic policies. After 2015, to sum up, it was totally risky and vain and completely populist for the new government to try to follow a different policy that was not well planned, and it was not conceived in any kind that could be negotiated with the European Union.
Hi, thank you very much for this very informative and interesting talk. Talking about differences when it comes to politics, and I think you showed very well how interesting it is to compare different countries when it comes to the crisis, because it was such a deep impact in the economics and the politics. And my question is on social mobility. Could you say a little bit about that? If you compare the different countries, if they're, if the crisis changed something there, or if there are different programs of, I don't know, how the countries could overcome problems of social mobility, because the topic of poverty is always related to questions of social mobility.
Okay, thank you also for this question. By social mobility, I understand a sociological concept. Social mobility in the four countries under study, I think, should be looked from different perspectives. This is so because we have countries which differ a lot in some respects of social class structure, gender relations, and also regional, not ethnic mostly, but regional composition. So in Portugal, we have a much more modern society compared to Spain, Italy, and Greece. If you look at the social structure from a gender viewpoint, Portuguese women participate in the labor market to a much, much larger degree than Spanish, Greek, or Italian women. So there is, in Portugal, I think, more leeway for social mobility, particularly because you have households which are sustained by this model, which is not traditional. The Portuguese model involves, on the one hand, two breadwinners, and on the other hand, there is a long-term, well-organized social protection system to fight unemployment and poverty in Portugal, which existed before the crisis. So although I have not studied this so well as I should have, my first answer is that Portugal would be a country in which you would expect that social mobility would progress faster than other countries. In Italy, Greece, and Spain, you have more traditional societies, and you have many more regional disparities compared to Portugal. Why? Because among the I should be more clear, about the 10 most underdeveloped regions of the European Union, and that is regions which you can find in every single of the 27 countries of the European Union. Spanish and Greek regions always are included. So you look at yearly statistics on which are the poorest regions of the European Union. You have some East European regions, but you also have Spanish regions like Extremadura and Greek regions like Western Macedonia. There is a region by that name, and also Central Macedonia. These are very poor regions. So there are regional disparities which in these countries, I think, limit the opportunities for social mobility. In terms of social class structure, again, you have to figure out that you talk about a very advanced economy compared to the other three economies. This is Italy, large economic power in Europe, even compared to Spain, an export-oriented economy. So in that case, in the case of Italy, as you know, social mobility in the southern part of Italy used to take place only through channels of recruitment to the public sector of Italy. Whereas social mobility in the north of Italy used to take place clearly through higher salaries and wages for Italian workers working in the export industries of Italy. So in Italy, you have to make this distinction between more advanced and less advanced regions. In terms of social class structure, it is also very difficult to give you an answer even if someone would have studied this very interesting question much more than I have, because we have in all four countries, and particularly so in Greece and Italy, a very large underground economy. This includes the tourist business, includes also very small companies which are not necessarily in the tourist sectors of these countries, and includes part of the agricultural sector. Small producers, owners of very small businesses, and people involved in the tourist sector in these four countries declare incomes which are far below, that's the correct word, they should have been. Thus, you may have unrecorded, unregistered social mobility, people who have larger sums of income that go unaccounted. So they, over time, if you start a business on a Greek island, which I hope you do, you will become very rich between the months of May and October every year, and most of your income will not be taxed. If you are a small business owner in southern Italy, you may not be taxed regardless of whether you are in the tourist business or not. Thus, you have various channels towards social mobility which are not caught by the usual, they're not analyzed by the usual literature on social mobility.
To what extent have refugees been a burden on these countries, and has that exacerbated the economic and political situation especially in Greece and Italy?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is also a very interesting question. The refugee problem started becoming very large after the countries had started recovering from the economic crisis. with exception of the case of Greece. So the refugee inflow, the inflow of refugees and migrants, acquired very large proportions in 2015 and 2016, the first half of 2016. So that was a burden on Greece and Italy more than in the case of Spain. But it was not so much an economic problem as a political problem, because in these countries, particularly Italy and Greece, the anti-migrant agenda became, as you know, a major agenda of the political campaigns of populist parties. These were the Nazi Party and the Nationalist Party I mentioned in the case of Greece, but mostly the Nazi Party in Greece, and also the populists in Italy. After all, we do have large financial support packages channeled towards Greece, and we have discussed whether and how this money has been used in the correct fashion. And these are financial packages which are not related to the financial support packages I mentioned. So Greece was given new funds to be able to host this large inflow of refugees and migrants. And the fact that we have had refugees in Greece on the Greek islands first and Athens later was a mixed blessing. On the one hand, it was a huge pressure on the local economies because there was a high demand for all kinds of services and products. Imagine that you live in an island like the island of Lesbos in the northeast Aegean, and this suddenly, with a span of a few months, sees its population becoming doubled, like 30,000 inhabitants. Then you have another 30,000 people landing, actually. Unfortunately, not all of them, because there were so many victims in this passage from the Turkish coast to the islands, landing on your island, and these people emerge from the sea, and these emerge of this and appear in your village, let's say in a village in the island of Lesbos, by the thousands. So that was a pressure on the local economy, but it was also, and this is not perhaps very well known, it was a blessing because local businesses did very well. Of course, it's true that also in Italy and in Greece, there was a large-scale generosity of these societies who offered shelter, clothes, bread, and food to the refugees, but some of the local businessmen and businesswomen exploited these refugees and exploited them by selling various goods to them at unbelievably high prices. So it was a mixed blessing. Pressure on the local economy, but also an effort to become rich in a short time span.
Yes, thank you. I have two questions, if I may. And one of them is, was there let's say, a more gentle alternative to this austerity? And the second question is, to what extent do you think that pressure from, the donors, let's say the Germans, may have made the austerity either more severe or less severe than it had to be? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. You have been probably reading Greek newspapers, and I congratulate you for this. Okay. It's true that it would be difficult to have any other policy option except for some kind of austerity, but the mix of policies was probably not the correct one. We couldn't probably know this in 2010, in 2011. With the benefit of hindsight, you could say that the public spending cuts, the public investment cuts, cuts in welfare benefits, pensions, social assistance benefits were very abrupt and very large scale, which means that in a span of 2 years between 2010 and 2012, in many of these, in almost all of these countries, particularly in Greece, you had a series of measures which led to the exorbitant rates of poverty and unemployment. With the benefit of hindsight, we could say that austerity was necessary, some kind of austerity was needed, but it could have been paced at a different, let's say, rhythm, and it could have been accompanied by some kind of concern, policy concern for the victims of this. Dismissals of workers, that is very important for the countries I discuss, the fact that thousands of small businesses went out of business. And if you are a businessman, you are not, many of these countries, you are not really covered by the unemployment insurance because this is for dependent employees. So my first answer is no, there was no other way, regardless of what populists of the left and the right have been telling us and have been publishing articles in Greek newspapers for 8-9 years now. But the policies adopted looked, some people say, very much like IMF conditionality policies imposed in a very short time span in different kinds of economies, not the advanced economies I was talking to you about. Thus, there was some kind of incompatibility, first of all because more or less the same recipe was used, and secondly because, and that I think is the most important point, in a frame of panic to prevent other Eurozone countries to fall in the same situation as Greece had fallen. The measures were front-loaded and were very aggressive in terms of austerity. Some kind of austerity was necessary. I must say this because there are so many people who say that this was foolish on the part of the European Commission or national governments in the countries under study to do, and there was a different way to, I don't know, what, to boost domestic demand on the basis of what? Rising the public debt more, or inflating bank loans given by banks of Spain to Spanish citizens? Some kind of contraction was necessary. Regarding the role of Germany, and not only Germany, but other strong European economies and their representatives, Finland, the Netherlands, in the beginning were insistent on a series of measures. These were measures which were not necessarily measures of economic policy reform. These were measures which related to many other public policies. And that is not only the case of Greece. We had packages of reform that related to the economy, the welfare, the labor system, labor market system, education, training, vocational training, what we call active labor market measures, and public health, and many, many other sectors. Gradually, national governments of the countries I talked about resisted a lot, I think, reforms in non-economic sectors, obeyed pressure or adapted to pressure to implement reforms in the economy. And then focusing in particular in the case of Greece, there was a turning point which I'm not sure how to, I'm not sure when this happened. A turning point could be 2013, 2014, at which seeing that non-economic reforms were sluggish or strongly resisted, international lenders and foreign governments, including the German government, gave up on requiring such reforms. They gave up on requiring reforms in, I don't know, active labor market measures, in public administration, in many other non-economic sectors. And they wanted only to see results regarding the lowering of budget deficits, the achievement of budget surpluses, the stabilization of public debt, this kind of results. And that is very visible, I think, in the reform programs which were which were agreed between, for instance, the radical left nationalist government of Greece on the one hand and the European Commission on the other hand. So I would put some blame on the German government, but much less than other analysts. I hope this is not recorded either.
So one thing about, one is a point, I have two things. One is a point of, I think it's correct that the nature of the debt was different across countries, especially in Italy, that much of the debt is actually owned by Italian citizens in the form of owning bonds, whereas the debt, I don't know, in Greece, I think, is loaned, and that matters. That has a big that matters politically, but it's also the meaning of the debt is a little different. If you're owning, if you owe back to your own citizens, it's unclear how to think about the nature of the what sovereign debt really means in that case, right? And defaulting means. So that's just a point of, and I think
that's true. Thanks for
so. My question is, I didn't quite get a firm read on the following in terms of your thoughts. Whether, so partly there are different outcomes here, right? At the end, right? Now, you had the data from 2017, 2018. I didn't quite get a sense of how you weigh the legacies versus the fact that while they converged on a lot of the public administration reforms, they weren't all the same. And in fact, your answer to George Sabellis was that Greece didn't implement certain things as they were supposed to, according to the international lending groups and the MOUs. And so, what's the weight of the kind of historical legacy, versus the actual implementation in explaining these outcomes? I didn't get a sense of the relative weight you were giving to those, because they're really different stories, right? One story is, I mean, in a nutshell, one is there's not too much Greece can do given where it started from, versus if it had just done things correctly over the last 6 years, it would be in better shape. And those are very different stories. And I guess, and they're very different conclusions, right? I mean, anyway.
Thanks for this point, which is a very good critical point, and I should take into account when I rethink about this topic and perhaps about this presentation. A possible answer would be the following. Even before the crisis started, the Spanish and the Portuguese public administrations, including their civil service personnel, were more open to reform compared to the Italian and the Greek one, by which I mean public administrations and civil service personnel. So there was a much stronger tradition of old-fashioned functioning of public administration in Italy and Greece compared to Portugal and Spain. And then that should have been taken into account in my analysis in showing why public reform was not as forthcoming in Italy and Greece compared to Spain and Portugal, and why the management of the crisis was not as successful in Italy and Greece compared to Spain and Portugal. Second point, political elites also matter. So after 2010, when the crisis started, first of all, as I offered as an answer to Professor Tsebellis, in Greece, as in Italy, there were governments of the center-right, or parties actually of the center-right, which resisted neoliberal economic policies or austerity policies. And that is different from the situation in Portugal and Spain, where you had consensus over some kind of austerity, which was implemented in Portugal and Spain. So there was also not only an administrative legacy, but also a kind of political choices made by governments in Italy and Greece, which are different from the political choices by the governments of Portugal and Spain that were in power after the crisis started. So if I weigh this, this situation, I think in Italy and Greece, the very traditional old-fashioned structure and function of the public sectors plus the political profile and political public policy choices of the governments should be taken into account as factors of non-implementation of reform compared to the cases of Portugal and Spain, where even before the crisis, these two countries, Portugal and Spain, were more open to reform. But I have to rethink about this. Thank you.
Can you give us a brief update on Alex Tsipras? How he's doing after?
I don't know. He looks good. I mean, on photographs.
Well, after his, after he was given a vote of confidence.
Ah, okay. Well, his party, which is Syriza, the radical left party, has been trailing in all opinion polls for the last 2 years. You cannot trust opinion polls in Greece because sometimes they are not managed well on the field, or they are biased before even the sampling is done. But generally, there are many, many opinion polls, one after the other, showing that the center-right party, which is the New Democracy Party, is ahead of the radical left party by a margin which could range between 5% and 14%. The second point is, however, that we should take into account that the voters of the radical left party have not rallied around their leader or their party, and they are much more undecided when it comes to declare which party they will vote for. So the parties of the voters of the center-right show on public opinion surveys much more concentration, and they show that they are not concentration, that they are mobilized already behind their leader and their party, and they are more decided regarding the fact that they will cast a vote for the center-right party. But also, to answer your question in a more straightforward fashion, in terms of the two questions, who is going to be next prime minister and who is the most popular leader, two different questions. On both counts, the current prime minister trails behind the leader of the opposition, whose name is Mitsotakis, and is the leader of the center-right party of the opposition.
Time for one more question if anyone has any burning questions. Otherwise, we're just about out of time. Okay, then let's thank Dr. Sotiropoulos again.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate that you participate in this event, and I thank you for the questions, which were tremendously useful. Thank you.